I have no doubt I'm going to cop some hate in the comments for this video because we're once again talking to Kurt's Card Care, but rather than talk through the service specifically, I've got a pretty clear-cut example here that's popped up in the last day or two that clearly showcases all the issues with people using this kind of service, in particular with sellers that sell it to prospective customers, don't disclose it to the customer, and then when the customer finds out, they're pretty upset, right? And it just perfectly summarizes the fact that just because you're okay to use it doesn't mean your potential buyers are. And it's a very interesting one because, like I said, it is a clear-cut example. Now, this was something that I was tagged in a few times on Twitter by many different people, including Tiffany Cards, who have given praise for on this channel in the past, because JD9 Cards, who sells a lot on Twitter, he's got a pretty decent following, listed this 1953 Satchel Paige SGC4 for $1,000. Now, because this guy does sell a lot of people watch his auctions, and sales, I should say, quite closely. And this user over here, ENT, saw it and he said, well, that's interesting because, this used to be in a PSA 2 slab. And he goes on to say, well, I wonder if PSA card caught it as altered or if SGC grading was the first choice, because if you look, at the two cards, in particular this top left corner, you'll see that, it's clearly been cleaned up and touched up, altered in some capacity. So, Ian's question is, well, you cracked it out of a PSA slab, you cleaned it, did you try and send it to them first and PSA denied it, which is why it went to SGC, or did you just happen to send it to SGC in the first place? But, surprisingly, to this guy's credit, at least, he came out and said that he did in fact use Kurt's Card Cam. Now, if we go back to the things I spoke about in the last two videos on this topic, I mentioned that when you're selling the card, you should be disclosing it. He didn't do it in this instance until he got pressured by somebody. But JD9 Cards essentially goes on to say, well, yep, I cleaned the dirt, off the top left using Kurt's Card Care. I thought it was a nice card. Removed some dirt/stain using distilled water. This is accepted by grading companies, which, people have been saying, and yes, it's happened, for a long time. People have been doing this to pre-war cards, pre-80s and all that kind of stuff, doing it for that long. But I can't find any wording on any of these websites that say it's okay, but maybe I'm wrong. I think it's just one of those things that they say it's okay, or people think it's okay because they can't spot it. These graders can't spot it. But I continue. If you don't remove ad paper, it is good in my book. I don't see the problem cleaning dirty paper, but to each their own. This is not altering by trimming, etc. But, as we said before, this is altering in some capacity. Some people disagree, but, the general gist of what we saw where I put out that poll and we put some comments out in the last two videos, it looked like, 70% of people were not okay with this kind of stuff. But, this situation gets very interesting and I think speaks to, the mindset of some of the people that use this service. And, JD9 Cards might feel like he's a good guy. Maybe he is a good guy. I'm not accusing him of anything like that. But when you're looking at this situation, the optics are quite poor. It very much looks like somebody's done something and does not want to disclose it because they want to maximize the amount of money that can be made. And that's sort of where the rest of this conversation goes. And, JD9 Cards might get offended if he sees this, but, the optics speak for themselves in this instance. And maybe you don't agree with that, but that's how, the general public is going to perceive you. But you've got ENT over here and he says, well, thanks, Jonah. And then he goes on to say, well, you've known it was the transparency and honesty behind it. And this is where, again, it gets a little bit interesting because he goes on to say, and when an expensive card came back as altered, sold to a friend as raw, and then initially lied to about it when another company saw it as altered too, that's where the problem lays. Thanks for speaking up. And that's a bit cryptic, but JD9 Cards gives a bit more context because he goes on to say, well, he was immediately refunded. It was never graded altered before I sold it. I 100% thought it would grade. And this person, Sean, who replies next, is the person in question that JD9 Cards, sold this card to, i.e. the person that Ian is referring to. And this is, a bit confusing, but just bear with me. Sean goes on to say, well, that's not 100% true, is it? You agreed to sell it to me after PSA graded it. The problem was that PSA wouldn't grade it. They said it was altered. So you turned around and sold it raw to somebody else. It may not have graded altered, but you knew it had problems and sold it as legit anyway. And this is like, again, an interesting thing, right? Because this obviously was not disclosed to the potential buyer down the line because he goes on to say, well, again, I thought PSA was wrong. They aren't 100% accurate. Obviously, no grader is. They said altered due to altered stock, which means pressing. I certainly never pressed the card. The card had a micro wrinkle, which they thought was pressed. I've seen many examples from others where one sub you get altered and the next you don't. It is no different than getting a 5 one sub and a 6 on the next. The companies make mistakes, but that's all well and good, but this goes to the things we've spoken about consistently, in particular with Kurt's Card Care, where people use that service and then don't disclose it because they think they know better. Again, in this instance, you've had somebody, crack a card, potentially do something to the card before they resubmit it to PSA. PSA say, hang on a minute, we're not going to grade this thing. He then goes ahead and sells it to somebody else, but doesn't disclose that PSA said it was no good. You know, if you were so confident in the fact that PSA was wrong, you should have been telling the customer that. Like, that's what honesty is. That's what transparency is. And I don't want to be doing business with people that are sort of withholding that information from me. Like, yes, I can understand these graders make mistakes, but in this situation, would you feel comfortable buying a card from that individual? I personally wouldn't. And again, you know, that might be an unfair thing to say. This person might be a really good person, might be a really genuine and humble human being. But when you're reading this, the optics don't look good. It doesn't seem very trustworthy. And I want to hear what you guys have to say down below as well, because obviously he'd done something to this card, touched it up, cleaned it, didn't disclose it when selling it. That's already a red flag in my book, because he knows if he tells people, they're not going to buy it. But then down here, he's done something also very similar, where he agreed to sell something to somebody after he did things to it, after it was graded by PSA. PSA said, well, hang on a minute, we're not going to touch it. The person then doesn't want to buy it, obviously, because PSA said it was altered, and then sells it to somebody else but doesn't disclose that, right? That's not transparency, in my opinion, no matter how confident you are. And, you know, even if you are, you know, super confident, tell that to the buyer. Tell them why you think PSA is wrong. Like, that's sort of what you would do in that instance. You don't think you know better and then withhold that information from people. Keep that information to yourself, because they deserve to know. And when you're sort of withholding information like that, it's not a good way to do business, in my opinion. And you eventually get caught out with stuff like this. And I'll repeat myself, he might be a good guy, but it's sort of hard to believe that when you're seeing practices like that. And it just goes back to, you know, the things we spoke about when my concerns lay with stuff like Kurt's Card Care, because they're not telling you things because they know buyers are going to react differently. And it's not just that they've, you know, used a polish on a card and they're not telling you that because it's whatever, what's the big deal? It's like, well, if they're using that mindset in that one particular instance of using Kurt's Card Care and not disclosing it to you, it goes back to the things I've said many times. What else are they not telling you about? You know, if there's little things like, you know, polish that they're not telling you about, which so many people think polish is fine, you know, there's worse things that they're doing in the background that they're also not telling you about. And that's a clear-cut example here. So I want to hear what you guys have to say. Both of these cards, per my understanding, have been added by Tiffany Cards to their altered card database. I'll put a screenshot up of their website again. Actually, I think I can bring it up here. If you guys are not aware, I've shown this website many times. I can click on it and I'll let it load and then open it. But these two cards have both been added to the altered database because something like that deserves to be known to potential buyers. And, you know, as I've shown before, this website is so fantastic. I've done a few reviews of it where you sort of click through in each of the sports and it breaks down, you know, the exact cert, the exact card itself, whether or not it's been altered, who it was reported by, what the issue with the card, whether or not it's stolen, all that kind of stuff. And the website does take a little bit to load, as I've talked to, you know, in the past as well. But when it does, it's essentially a giant database. You just do Control F and then, you know, search for a card you want to buy. And if it's on here, stay the F away from it. As you can see now, because it's finally loaded, the cards in question, images, serial number, all that kind of stuff, right? This is a really important database for you to be using, especially if you're buying vintage cards, you know, across all sports. You have baseball in here, as you saw on the previous page, football, basketball, soccer, I think a few others as well. I think hockey's in here, amongst many other things. Sorry, I got the hiccups. But that was sort of it for this one. I really want to hear what you guys have to say down below, because like I said, so many people came out and defended that kind of behavior to use a service like this. But this is, you know, what goes wrong when you don't tell people what you've done. Because not only does it make you look bad, but it opens a can of worms based on every other deal you maybe done in the past. I just don't know. How can you send a card into a grader, they tell you something about that card, and then you don't tell prospective buyers? If you're so confident, I'll say it again, if you're so confident in your ability over PSAs, tell the buyer why PSA is wrong. Don't not disclose it. So, you know, hate me all you want for talking about Kurt's Card Care again, but I thought this was a really important example to talk to. So share your thoughts down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.